It's one of the busiest land crossings on the planet. Billions of dollars in auto parts, farm goods, and products crisscrossing the border every single day. The economies of the United States and Canada are so deeply intertwined that for decades, the thought of severing that link was unimaginable. But in late February 2026, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, found himself staring down that very possibility. It was a moment defined by an economic war, a sense of betrayal, and a direct challenge to the President of the United States. This wasn't just another trade dispute, it was a political calculation, a bet that the ground in Washington was finally starting to shift. This is the story of that bet, and the explosive events that set the stage for a new front in the trade war. Let's start with the bombshell from the U.S. Supreme Court. On Friday, February 20th, 2026, the court handed down a landmark decision. It looked like a clear win for Canada and free trade. But this story isn't about a simple legal victory. It's about what happened next. The court's ruling was a major blow to President Trump, but his reaction was even more dramatic, immediately plunging the relationship into a new kind of chaos. Premier Doug Ford was reading the political tea leaves in Washington, and what he saw was an opportunity. He saw a president who had been checked, at least for a moment, by his own country's highest court. And in the high-stakes world of international trade, that perceived weakness is leverage. This wasn't just another week in a trade dispute. It was the opening shot in a new, more aggressive phase of Canada's strategy. And to get the gravity of that moment, you first have to understand the legal bombshell that started it all. Section 1. The double-edged sword of the Supreme Court. On Friday, February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled that President Trump had exceeded his authority. He had been using a 1977 law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEP, to unilaterally impose tariffs. This was the legal tool he'd used to justify a whole range of duties on countries from Canada to China. The court's logic was simple. The Constitution gives the power to set tariffs to Congress, not the president. A president can only act if Congress specifically gives him that authority, and the court found that the IEEPA wasn't a blank check. On paper, it was a massive rebuke of executive overreach. For a second, it seemed like a return to normalcy. But here's the fine print, the part that got lost in the headlines. The ruling was incredibly narrow. It only applied to tariffs levied under that one specific law, the IEEPA. It did not touch the most damaging and economically significant tariffs, the Section 232 national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. Those tariffs, which had already caused serious pain in Ontario's industrial heartland, were still firmly in place. So while it was a victory, it was on a single front in a much bigger economic war. As one minister put it, critical work lies ahead because the tariffs pressuring the Canadian economy the most were unaffected. The Supreme Court had closed one door for the president, but it left others wide open, and Donald Trump didn't waste a second. Within hours of what he called a deeply disappointing decision, he announced he was pivoting to a new strategy. He declared a new 10% global tariff on all imports, set to begin on Tuesday, February 24th. This was the real context for the escalating tensions. It wasn't a simple victory celebration. It was a reaction to the chaos that followed. The court offered a brief moment of clarity, only for the president to immediately sow more uncertainty. The old IEEPA tariffs were dead, but a new global 10% threat had just been born. And this new threat was part of the same pattern of unpredictability that had plagued Canadian businesses for years. It forced leaders like Doug Ford to confront the president's volatile reaction and signal that Canada wouldn't be playing defense anymore. Faced with this chaos, Canada's response wasn't just to complain, it was to activate a strategic playbook, one honed over years of sparring with the Trump administration. Premier Doug Ford, leading Canada's economic engine, became one of the loudest voices articulating this strategy, which was aimed at multiple audiences: his own voters, the federal government in Ottawa, and most importantly, the political establishment in Washington, D.C. Let's break down the key parts of that playbook. Ford and other Canadian leaders stopped using the sanitized language of diplomacy. Words like irritants or disagreements were out. Instead, they started calling it an economic war. This wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was a strategic reframing. It validates the real pain felt by workers and businesses hurt by the tariffs. It also gives the government the political cover to take drastic retaliatory measures. You don't pull a friendly nation's products from liquor store shelves during a simple trade dispute. But in an economic war, all measures are on the table. It tells the world that Canada sees this not as a negotiation between partners, but as a defense against hostile economic acts. This was perhaps the most sophisticated part of the strategy, aimed squarely at Trump's own political base. Instead of making it a Canada versus America fight, Ford and others flipped the script. They argued that the person who ultimately pays for a tariff isn't the foreign country, but the American consumer and the American business. The auto sector is the perfect example. Parts can cross the border 6 or 7 times before a car is fully assembled. A tariff on a Canadian part gets baked into the cost of the American assembly plant. That plant then either has to eat the cost or it passes it on to the American who buys the car. By framing it this way, Canada attempts to build a coalition of opposition inside the United States, appealing to the economic self-interest of American workers and companies. When the U.S. imposes a broad tariff on steel, Canada's response isn't to just mirror it. Instead, they've developed retaliatory lists that look at first glance a little bizarre: Kentucky bourbon, Florida orange juice, Wisconsin toilet paper. But there's a method to the madness. These products are chosen specifically because they're made in the home states and districts of powerful American political leaders. The goal of a tariff on Kentucky bourbon isn't just to hurt distillers. It's to make the phone of the Senate Majority Leader from Kentucky ring with angry calls from his own constituents. It's about turning American industries into a powerful lobbying army for Canada's cause. While the federal government controls tariffs, provinces have their own powerful economic levers. Premier Ford, in particular, has shown he's not afraid to use them. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario, or the LCBO, is one of the single largest buyers of alcohol in the world. The threat of delisting American products is a devastating blow to U.S. wineries and distilleries. Even more powerful is the threat around energy. Ontario is a major exporter of electricity to states like New York and Michigan. In the escalating tensions that followed the February court ruling, Ford made it clear he would consider using that leverage. In fact, threats to Ontario's power supply in March would lead to Trump doubling down on steel and aluminum tariffs. It's a high-risk, high-reward move, but it shows a willingness to hit back where it hurts. This entire conflict is more than just economics. It's a high-stakes political chess match. For both Donald Trump and Doug Ford, the tariff war is packed with risks and potential rewards. For Donald Trump, the America First tariff policy has always been a core part of his political brand. It fires up his base, who believe other countries have been taking advantage of the U.S. for decades. Backing down in the face of Canadian pressure could look like weakness. The aggressive, unpredictable threats aren't just policy. They are a political performance. But that performance has a cost. As Canadian leaders correctly identified, tariffs are a tax on American consumers. While they might play well at a rally, they play poorly at the cash register when the price of a car or groceries goes up. This creates a powerful counterpressure from within the U.S., from business groups and Republican politicians in trade-dependent states. Trump is caught in a political vice. He needs to look tough for his base, but the consequences of his toughness are hurting key constituencies he also needs. For Doug Ford, the calculation is just as complex. As a conservative premier, you wouldn't expect him to be picking a fight with a Republican president. But this situation lets him rise above partisan politics and become a defender of Ontario's and Canada's national interest. There's no faster way for a Canadian leader to rally support than to be seen standing up to perceived American bullying. It allows him to unite people across the political spectrum against an external threat, becoming Premier of Team Ontario. The risk, of course, is that the strategy backfires. If Ford pushes too hard and Trump decides to escalate dramatically, the economic consequences for Ontario could be catastrophic. Ford is walking a tightrope. He has to be strong enough to put pressure on Washington, but not so aggressive that he provokes an all-out trade war with no way back. It's a calculated gamble, one based on reading the shifting political winds in America. He's betting that Trump's ability to inflict damage is limited by growing opposition at home. If he's right, his tough stance will be remembered as a successful defense of Canadian interests. If he's wrong, the fallout could be severe. What we witnessed in late February 2026 wasn't just another trade spat. It was a fundamental stress test of the Canada-U.S. relationship, brought on by a period of intense uncertainty. The Supreme Court ruling that struck down some of Trump's tariffs was the spark. It seemed like a victory, but it was a limited one. President Trump's immediate pivot to a new 10% global tariff proved the war was far from over. It had just entered a new phase. In response, Canadian leaders like Doug Ford didn't just express concern, they activated a playbook of proactive, strategic offense. They reframed the conflict as an economic war to justify aggressive countermeasures. They weaponized Ontario's unique economic leverage, from the threat against alcohol sales to its critical supply of electricity, to inflict targeted political pain inside the United States. This isn't about abandoning a partnership. It's about redefining its terms under pressure. It's a declaration that Canada and its most powerful province will no longer be a passive victim of American policy. It will be an active player that uses its economic weight and political savvy to defend its own interests. The final outcome remains uncertain. But one thing is clear, the board has been reset. The question is no longer just what Donald Trump will do to Canada, but how Canada will continue to navigate a changing America to its own advantage.